Hello again, friends. Welcome to another In Other News. February 4th, 2013. Lots been going on. Of course, I've been slacking on the podcast, but that's okay. Let's play catch up now for the new year. And I wanted to talk about a part of the planet which actually has not been getting a lot of press lately. And I think it should, because it's an important part of planet Earth that may be unraveling, but not in a panicked, destructive way that everybody should worry about, but an interesting way that it seems like it's devolving. And I'm talking about the EU. Let's entitle this one, Is the EU Becoming E-Useless? What a great way to get back into the podcast. Now, the subtext for this is, are the EU-3 going their separate ways? For those of you who have taken my class, you know what the EU-3 is, the big three economies, the big three states with, I think, the big three biggest populations within the European Union, that trifecta being France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Has anybody been paying attention to what's going on with these three countries? Because, quite frankly, the reason I'm considering the EU as maybe devolving is that this trifecta of the major powers all have been making news in the last year, mostly on their own, and the EU itself has only been making news as a useless entity that can't come together or get anything done. Now, most of that news has been about how they've been failing financially to get their house in order and hold it together, and what the future's going to be. And so, on top of that, the kind of bad news about all the EU sucks, which I don't believe, by the way. I think the EU's awesome. But on top of that kind of doom and gloom about the EU financially, fiscally, economically, most of the main stories out of Europe are about how these individual powers are doing things quite on their own. And again, that's what's important here. The EU, the European Union, has been this grand experiment to kind of unify Europe, much like the United States of America. Hell, for those of you that took my class 10 years ago, I used to say, are we evolving this entity towards a United States of Europe? And 10 years ago, it really looked like it was going that way. They were talking about common environmental policies, which they have, common financial policies, which they have, common banking systems, which they have, but also they were talking about common defense systems, which they kind of have been messing with, common laws, which they kind of are there for. So it really was getting to a point of, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that wow, this place is turning into a full-on integrated United States of Europe, much like the United States of America, a super state, as it were. I don't know that that's happening anymore. I know it's not happening right this second, because the EU-3, they are the trifecta of power. And I won't say they're not getting along anymore. There's no imminent World War III breaking out. Hell, they're too busy eating crepes and drinking, Oktoberfest beers. But these entities are having a decreasing amount of interactivity, and they've made news for what they've individually been up to. Now, I'm going to pick on the Frenchies first, because lo and behold, I need to do a whole podcast just on them. The come-from-behind, 21st century, perhaps reinvigorated world power is France. No one would have predicted that 5 years ago, even 50 years ago. But here we are, 2013. The French have just finished conducting what, by all measures, is a successful campaign, military campaign, into northern Mali to root out, and otherwise destroy Islamic extremist terrorists. And it has been successful. Now, it's been successful for maybe more reasons than you're thinking about. I think it's successful not because they blew up a bunch of yahoos running around the desert, but because they were invited there to do it, almost begged, and I don't mean to make fun of the Mali government, but almost begged the French to come in and help out. The French were very hesitant. They looked at all options. They progressed slowly. They built a power base of other states to rely on discreetly behind closed doors. Hey, Germany, can you help out? Hey, France, or hey, UK, can you help out? Hey, United States, can you help out? And then they have coordinated, or helped coordinate, an African grouping of states which has promised to come help out, come stabilize. That, to me, is what we called in the old school coalition of the willing, but indeed it actually is a coalition of willing participants across the globe. It didn't even go through the United Nations. So here we have the French. The French, the country we like to make fun of the most for surrendering, that has succeeded in a difficult mission, a foreign intervention that has really not pissed off anybody, has been largely successful from a military standpoint, and has brought together multiple power bases from Europe, America, and Africa to help solve a problem. Bravo! Bravo, Frenchies! What you might not have known is they also were conducting military exercises over in Somalia. I think they sent some secret crew like French Navy SEALs or French Foreign Legion, I don't know who it was, to try and rescue some hostages in Somalia. It failed, by the way. But the point is that France has this newfound, new-grown backbone. And they are starting to really represent in terms of, hey, we are a power to be reckoned with again. We are not waving the white flag. We are not afraid to use military power. And we're doing it in a successful way. So the French, with a newfound military role on planet Earth. Interesting. Now again, I said the French. It was not the European Union army that went to save the day in Mali. I'm not even sure that was ever a possibility. Why? I have no answer. It was never a possibility. The EU does, supposedly on paper, have an army. I know the army, their EU forces were deployed to the Balkan Peninsula after the U.S. bombing of Serbia and places like that. They have been in the Balkans, this EU force, but not even whispered, not even called upon to help out with this international affair. But the French were. Fascinating stuff. Okay, what about the other trifecta members? Germany, for its part, has, I won't say been isolating itself, but Germany has really become the banker of Europe. And it increasingly seems like Germany doesn't give a rat's ass what anybody else thinks about finance or the economy of Europe in general. You've heard me rage about this in prior podcasts, but Germany's Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, really plays much more of a bigger role in the European stage than she does even in her country. Now, she's just the leader of Germany, but as you've heard me rant about before, Germany really, because they're so rich, and they are the richest economy in Europe, the fourth richest economy on planet Earth, because they're so rich, they really kind of control the European central banks. There's German banks, and then there's the European Central Bank. It's almost like the U.S. National Reserve, I suppose, that really controls fiscal and monetary policy. And the Germans, because they're the biggest contributors, and they're the most stable economically, and they're the richest most economically, they kind of have a really huge role in that. And it seems like that's a role they're quite comfortable with. And again, I won't say they're isolating themselves, but the Germans have been the one for 2 years now that have said, we are going to tell you all what the economic policy of the EU is going to be. Greece, you're only going to get this much money and you're going to have to cut your budget. Italy, you're only getting this much money and you're going to have to cut your budget. Spain, Italy, Ireland, all you places that need money from the European Central Bank are going to have to do what Angela Merkel in Germany wants you to do. Now, there's been some pushing back on this from who? Did all the countries I just mentioned push back on this? Well, they tried, but nobody cared about them. It was the French who have pushed back on this. So again, you see the Germans, in their own right, as the economic masters of Europe, the French, who perhaps aren't really on board with German economic policy, and are now the military masters of Europe. And who does that then leave in the trifecta I haven't mentioned? The British! And what have they been doing? Nothing! And in fact, not only have they not been doing nothing, UK Prime Minister David Cameron has been on again, off again for months talking about, we may leave the European Union. Bam, that's what I'm talking about right there. So the three biggest powers, quite frankly, are on three different paths, each with their own little specialty, each kind of doing their own thing. And again, I'm not saying they don't like each other. I'm not saying it's conflict with each other. I'm just saying it looks like a devolution. Maybe France is going to be heading up any kind of EU military response in the future because they're the only ones doing it. Nobody else contributed troops to go help out France in Mali. The U.S. did. The Germans ponied up some money. African countries ponied up troops. No one else in Europe did. So the Frenchies may be becoming somehow a military leader. The Germans are obviously the economic leader. And the British, who are neither, have said, we don't even think we want to be in this gang anymore. Interesting, interesting times. Now, for those that follow this stuff, the Brits have been saying, there's always been a wing of people, the conservatives, the Tories, in Great Britain who have said, ever since the inception of the EU, that no, the British don't need that. We don't want to be part of Europe. We're better than them. And if that sounds snobbish, it is. And I think most British would probably agree with that. Yes, that's right. We are better than them. We are better than the Continentals. So this idea of a kind of a separate, not say separatist, but a group of politicians, a political movement to not be in the EU or to get them out of the EU has always existed. So don't mistake that this is something new. But what is new is that the Prime Minister of the country is seriously contemplating it, has been talking about it, has come outright and said, right to Angela Merkel's face, and you don't want to mess with that woman, but Cameron said right to Angela Merkel's face, we are going to have to at least renegotiate Britain's role in all this because we feel like we've given away too many sovereign rights to be part of this group that we don't really see that much benefit in anymore. That's one of the reasons why the Brits never fully adopted the European Union monetary unit, the euro. You can use the euro in Great Britain, but they maintained their pound. Why? Because they're British, and they're separate, and they don't really want to be a full part of that EU experiment, and they never have been, and now they're talking about bailing on it all together. Does that make sense now? Three main states, the EU-3, all three entities kind of going in separate directions, albeit slowly. The British, I should add, David Cameron did say recently that their plan now is to possibly, if they don't get a restructured role in the European Union, that they would like to put it to a referendum in Great Britain, possibly by this summer. That is, letting the people vote on it. And it's hard to see how the people won't vote themselves out at this point in the economic life of the European Union as a whole, which has kind of been sinking. One last geographic note, and I'll wrap this up. There's also kind of a slow devolution, a separateness that has underpinned the entire European Union experiment itself from the start that's made itself very obvious here as of late. And that is there's a very big north-south split. For those of you that don't know your geography, pull out a map of Europe and just for fun, go figure out where the richest countries are. Then figure out where the poorest countries are. You can figure it out at the same time by drawing a line right through the center of Europe. The northern countries, especially those Nordic countries, Germany, France, those Nordic countries, and the Brits, they're the richest countries. The poorest countries of Europe, oh, let's see, Greece, been in debt default for 5 years. Italy, been in a slow downward spiral till debt default for 2 years. Spain, almost collapsing. Portugal right behind them. You're starting to see it add up geographically. This north-south divide is very, very obvious in today's world. Not so obvious 50 or 60 years ago, apparently. But a lot of folks who want out of the EU or have talked about jumping out of the EU have said this is part of the reason why it's not going to work long term. All the money's up north. The north has to pay all the bills and pay all the taxes to help bail out all the sucky poor countries down south, like Spain and Greece et al. And possibly even some Eastern European countries, but that's another geographic division I won't even talk about now. Does that make sense? So is the EU getting EU-useless? Maybe between North and South increasingly, but definitely the trifecta, the big three powers of Europe, are really on their own paths right this second, not seeing eye to eye about a whole lot. And that, of course, speaks to the bigger issue, is it going to survive? If the big three can't agree on stuff and are not on the same page, how can you possibly expect the bigger union to survive this current economic calamity? I don't know, but maybe the Frenchies will come save the day with a fondue invasion. But that's all for now. Party on.